Chapter 1, Existence of God. I thought it would be fitting to start the course off by talking about the arguments of theology versus science. They're both arguments because they cannot be proven with 100% certainty. You cannot see, feel, touch, or prove the theories of that God exists, or even in the scientific theories that I'm going to talk about, such as the Big Bang Theory. So let's start off by talking about the science argument. And we'll talk about the theory that I just talked about, the Big Bang Theory. Most people have all heard about these theories, but I'm just going to cover them very briefly and go over them. Big Bang Theory started when astronomers noticed that the stars were moving away and that the universe was expanding. This suggested to them that at one point the stars were all clumped together and that the universe was a tiny little particle. Well, they surmised that that particle must have exploded or something happened, and matter and antimatter were created. They canceled each other out, and there were trillions upon trillions of explosions within the blink of an eye. These explosions propelled everything outward in every direction, and you get what would be time start, the start of time. That's what the Big Bang Theory says, that the entire universe came from this trillions and trillions of explosions, but ultimately of a very tiny particle. What the Big Bang Theory does not go into is where did that particle come from? What was there to start time? What put it in motion? And what was going on right before? How long was there time? It also doesn't explain the container for which the universe is infinitely expanding in every direction. Is there a point where the universe will hit an edge? What is the container that it's in? Our next scientific theory is the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution tries to explain where all species came from. And this was developed by Charles Darwin, 1859. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species. In that book, he talked about three main points needed for a species to evolve. Those were natural selection, adaptation, and mutation. Now, Charles Darwin believed that every species came originally from one tree trunk. He believed in the tree of life and that all the branches were different species. But at one time, we came from a sponge, or what they called a molecular soup. So natural selection means that the strong survive. This survival of the fittest. And that those strong will pass those survival skills and have strong offspring. Adaptation is the species adapts characteristics or traits that increase its survival rate, that help it survive. A stronger physique, a different colored skin. And those adaptations are also passed down to its offspring, in which the species will increase its survival rate, its chance of survival. And then mutation, he believed, was that a species would have offspring that were mutated and created an entirely different species. Those mutations would also be sustainable and be passed down through their own offspring. So natural selection and adaptation are real phenomenon. They have been proven. A species does increase its survival rate by survival of the fittest, and those strong traits or qualities that were adapted to its environment can be passed down. So the species can increase its survival through those means. Unfortunately, what Darwin could not prove is that a mutated offspring would create an entirely new life form, and that mutation would be passed down through its generation after generation. Normally, under normal circumstances, a mutated offspring has an extremely less chance of surviving than a normal offspring. And then, lastly, Darwin never really went into the point of that first species, the molecular soup or the bottom of the tree trunk, where that came from. He didn't really go into explaining that. He just he stuck more on where the other species came from. So let's go into the theology side of it, and let's talk about belief in God and the theories on that side. And I want to talk about a philosopher, 13th century philosopher by the name of St. Thomas Aquinas. He had the philosophical, logical proofs of a deity or a God existing. He called it the argument of design, argument of intelligent design. And he had 5 logical proofs. I'm only going to go over 3 of them. They're very good. Now, I'm going to list the 3 here, and then I'm going to go into more detail of each one in the next coming slide. So, his first logical, philosophical proof that a God exists is that if everything in the world has a beginning, then God must have been that beginning. Now, you can get into a chicken or an egg argument and say, well, if everything is included, God has to include it. But he believed that God was eternal, so he was excluded from that argument. Second proof was that in a chaotic universe, there are a number of earthly order and scientific laws that have been put into place, and those had to be put into place by some higher being or some type of deity. The third proof or logic that he had regarding a deity existing was the rock versus the watch argument. And what that says is that if you were walking along and you came across a rock, what would the rock say about its creator? Well, it wouldn't really say much. But if you found a watch, what would the watch say about its creator? And ultimately, you would find out that the watch would tell you that whoever created the watch had to be a higher intelligence in order to create the watch. And he believed that our bodies, our brains, our organs, our heart have shown that there was a higher intelligence creating our bodies. So let's go into those proofs a little bit deeper, and we'll start with the first one. If you think about the Big Bang Theory and Thomas Aquinas' first proof, you could technically believe in the Big Bang Theory as well as with a God. Everything is in motion. Something had to put everything in motion. Time is motion. The planets are moving. God had to be the cause to put everything in motion, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Logically, that first particle in the Big Bang Theory, logically, something came from nothing. No matter how you think about it, at one point, something had to come from nothing. It's difficult to comprehend, but that's ultimately what happened. Something came from nothing. The Big Bang Theory says that when that first particle exploded, it created all this matter and antimatter, and those created trillions upon trillions of explosions. They canceled each other out. However, the physics of the Big Bang Theory say that the matter and antimatter must cancel each other out. So if you look at our universe, we have far more matter than antimatter, which means technically the universe should not exist. Matter and antimatter should cancel each other out, according to the Big Bang Theory. And as you see, we're still here. His second theory, order among chaos. If you look at the Earth in all its order, it is pretty fascinating to see the amount of order that we have. That being, let's say, the tides, the seasons, day and night, the Earth spinning on its axis, the laws of gravity. These are all earthly orders that came from a chaotic universe started in either one massive explosion followed by billions and trillions of other massive explosions, a very chaotic beginning, and yet we have a lot of order on this Earth. In addition to that, when we talk about the elements and compounds and their properties, they have constant properties. What I mean by that is, like, take water. Water will boil at 100 degrees Celsius and freeze at 0 degrees Celsius every single time. That's a constant property and not a variable that came from a chaotic universe. Again, recently the scientists has estimated the uniqueness of our planet in relation to all the other planets in the universe, and they estimated that uniqueness to be 1 in 700 quintillion. So pretty fascinating number. On his last proof, the rock versus the watch, and its logic, that he said that the brain itself shows that a far greater being had to develop our brains and how fascinating they are. And you know, we're just beginning to understand all its complexities. The archaeologists have found that the fossils show that our brains did not evolve. They almost appeared 50,000 years ago. And what I mean by that is 50,000 years ago, they have found fossils in writings and things that show that the brain had the ability to create, had the ability to create language and talk to one another. It developed the ability of learning and teaching its young from its mistakes, which is an awesome ability if you think about it. But these modern humans that came out were also coexisting with the Neanderthals, who were far less complex. You know, they found jewelry in the modern humans, which said they were thinking about their own appearance. And when you think about that metamorphosis of self-aware or self-conscious, we are the only species that happened to among all the species, and that including the prehistoric. So that the other mind-blowing thing to think about is at some point the Big Bang Theory believes that stardust became self-aware. Our bodies made of carbon and water all of a sudden became self-aware of itself. Elements became self-aware of themselves and gave themselves the ability of knowledge and learning. It's over the mind-blowing. What St. Thomas Aquinas did not know, and that we are discovering, is the intricacy of DNA molecules. The molecular biology and DNA coding that's being studied today cannot be explained by evolution or by chance. Let me give you an idea of what's going on. I'm not a molecular biologist, but I have looked into this. A DNA, which is in your cells, it creates proteins. And how it does that, it does it from amino acids. But these amino acids that are taken to make these proteins have to be put in a systematical order of either, that's why it's called a code. It has to be put into a code in order to make a functional protein. And then that protein will go on to do some type of cell function within the cell, within the body of the cell. So those amino acids that it's making, and there's thousands of them, have to be coded in a certain way. Now, scientists have figured out the probability of a DNA creating a protein from chance, just by doing it by chance, and it's 10 to the 160th power. To give you the astronomical odds of that happening, the estimation of atoms in our universe is 10 to the 80th power. It's half of the estimation it would be for a protein to be developed just by chance. It's astronomical. On top of that, when they talk about the proteins within the DNA, they say that the DNA acts very much like a computer CPU. You know, one of the famous quotes talking about Bill Gates is, Bill Gates was quoted as saying, DNA is far more complex than any computer program that's ever been written. That there is the exact definition of what Thomas Aquinas called intelligent design. We cannot explain molecular biology. And the neat part about DNA is that DNA is made up of proteins, and proteins need DNA. It's a chicken or an egg argument. They appeared. You can't have both. So scientists these days are trying to figure out how the heck proteins were made and DNA came about. In conclusion, St. Thomas Aquinas' arguments of design seem truer today than they were in the 13th century, and that mainly because of molecular DNA, molecular biology and DNA. The probability of life on Earth coming from chance the way that science wants to believe, the probability is too high they can't calculate it. When you talk about, I mean, let's throw everything in that I was talking about. When you throw in the uniqueness of the planet, then you talk about the evolution of the human brain and among all these species, and then you talk about the DNA coding. The probability is far too high a number to calculate. So what I'm trying to get at, my final thought is this. When it comes to the argument of design or belief in God versus the scientific argument, it takes far greater, more faith to believe in science than it does the belief in a God.